following in the wake of a global recession so bad that the whole world's financial system set on fire. Many companies went bankrupt overnight, and a small development studio struggling to pay bills going by the name of Larian Studios found themselves prematurely releasing a game called Divinity 2 Ego Draconis. You've likely never heard of it. Well, at least not the original version anyway. Divinity 2 Ego Draconis was released prematurely in 2009 because Larian Studios was on the brink of bankruptcy. They needed to release a game in order to have some form of cash flow. They were drowning in debt with no apparent way out. This game release was anything but usual. This release was pure desperation, a final Hail Mary pass to the public. You probably won't be surprised to hear that the game reviewed and sold poorly purely because they released it too early. But without releasing it early, Larian Studios would have certainly had to have filed for bankruptcy. This is a video explaining how close we were to Larian Studios' multiple near-death experiences and how Baldur's Gate 3 almost never existed. 2009 paints a very different picture to the Larian Studios that we know now in 2023. After releasing their unpolished and unfinished game, Larian Studios' reputation wasn't in the best spotlight. Even though they had the vision and the passion, their half-baked release meant they didn't have the reputation or the funding to really take off. 2012 was an incredibly pivotal time for both Larian Studios and Baldur's Gate 3, but not for the reasons you might think. Did you know that after the world economy stabilised in 2012 and the Olympics was being held here in London, Wizards of the Coast, the owners of the intellectual property that is known as Dungeons & Dragons, they were in the market for a development team to work on Baldur's Gate 3, and on that list of development studios, BioWare's name seemed to have been suspiciously crossed out. This was really suspicious because between 1998 and 2001, 2 games and 2 expansions, all developed by the gaming studio BioWare under the name of Baldur's Gate, were released. And if you asked anyone, they would say that these games were complete hits and were successful in every single way, and still remaining iconic to this very day. As BioWare was essentially the creator and the face of Baldur's Gate, it only makes sense that they would be the development studio to create Baldur's Gate 3, right? Well, actually, no, not exactly. BioWare actually backed out due to having commitments on other projects. They thought that this project was too heavy. They've since been on the record saying, "For us it's more of a function of, because we weren't in a position to do Baldur's Gate, hey, well, let's just create our own," and that's effectively what Dragon Age Origin is. So with BioWare out of the picture, Wizards of the Coast still needed a gaming studio to create their game. Larian Studios was a development company who had barely survived the global crisis. This timing and this opportunity for them was unfathomably perfect, as they were obsessed with creating a brilliant fantasy RPG game. Being able to win this business and work with Wizards of the Coast on Baldur's Gate 3, in their minds, was the big break that they needed. Larian Studios didn't know it at the time, but they were about to face a huge rejection that would ultimately save their studio from bankruptcy and prevent Baldur's Gate 3 from being released unfinished and unpolished, just like Ego Draconis. A half-desperate Larian Studios met with Wizards of the Coast to pitch for Baldur's Gate 3, but the Dungeons & Dragons owner laughed them out of the door. They thought that the Belgian studio was too green and too inexperienced. They considered the risk to be too damn high. I may have slightly downplayed the half-desperate nature of this meeting for Larian, because Divinity 2's premature release actually left Larian in serious debt. At the time, they were just one wrong step away from bankruptcy. Wizards of the Coast had almost certainly just saved Baldur's Gate 3 from certain destruction by not handing the reins to Larian Studios. But this rejection didn't put Larian off. They knew that they had the talent and the vision. They just needed a little bit of luck to land in their lap. Inspired by the idea of creating such a monumental game like Baldur's Gate, Larian Studios wanted to make one of their own dream RPGs. So the studio decided to go all in on its next project. Even though their financial situation was bad, they were adamant that they were going to keep their entire team of 30 or so developers together. So they actually started 2 different projects. The first project was the RPG that would become Original Sin, and a strategy game called Dragon Commander. Interestingly, Dragon Commander was actually meant to be the bigger project. However, They quickly realised that they were spread too thin and they couldn't finish both. All of their energy ended up going into Divinity Original Sin. Larian borrowed money from the bank, got outside investors, raised nearly $1 million on Kickstarter. They moved all of their team away from Dragon Commander just to help with Divinity Original Sin. Larian Studios have since admitted how many mistakes and desperate decisions the studio have made to continue developing Divinity Original Sin as long as possible. They were constantly fearful in the back of their mind of the Divinity 2 Ego Draconis situation. They did some pretty silly things at the time. Things like delaying tax payments so they could spend more money into the game. They spent money they didn't have just to add voice acting to improve the quality of the game. As a consumer and as a player of games, these are things that you would find essential. But as a business, they were playing with fire. This meant when Original Sin finally hit early access, the developers had to add thousands of bug fixes to their tracker, and they had to make significant gameplay changes based on feedback. To put into context how on the line Larian were when developing Divinity Original Sin, Larian initially only had €1.5 million to spend on Divinity, and they'd really hoped to build it on a budget of a maximum of €3 million. But in the end, the studio spent €4.5 million. It was a miracle that Larian didn't collapse and the game made it to release. They gambled their reputation, their jobs, their company, and their future on the release of a single game with a brand new IP. The fate of Larian Studios lay entirely in the hands of Divinity Original Sin 1, and the stakes could not have been higher. We see now that being rejected for a much more complicated and expensive project in Baldur's Gate, Wizards of the Coast actually saved both Larian Studios and Baldur's Gate 3 from certain collapse. It was ultimately for the greater good.
Yeah, the way we see it, it's all for the greater good.
When Larian Studios released Original Sin, it was clear that all of their hard work had paid off because Divinity Original Sin was successful enough that the public demanded a sequel. So Larian started work on that immediately. In August 2015, Larian launched a crowdfunding campaign on Kickstarter for Original Sin 2. They raised over $2 million. Shortly after, in September 2016, Divinity Original Sin 2 was released into early access. Now, at this point, Wizards of the Coast started taking notice. Not only was Divinity Original Sin 2 shaping out to be a brilliant game, but Larian Studios had their games in open access, readily taking on board feedback to improve the game for release. Wizards of the Coast loved this approach. So the studio that they thought once too green was in fact now looking like the obvious choice. When Divinity Original Sin 2 released back in September 2017, it managed to sell over $500,000 in less than 12 hours, making millions more over its lifetime. To this day, it's widely recognised as an incredible CRPG, and you'd be a fool not to give it a try. Larian Studio's success and experience gained between the years 2014 and 2017 was heard loud and clear. A whisper of rumours surfaced that Baldur's Gate was coming up next. As we now know, Wizards of the Coast reached out to Larian Studios with a completely different view on this once too green and once too small development studio. They recognised that Larian had to be the ones to make Baldur's Gate 3, as they were the only studio in the world that could truly do it justice. So they approached them and asked the question that Larian had been waiting years for. Do you still want to do it? To which the obvious answer was, yes, of course. Larian Studios creative director Sven has since been on record saying, "It's funny to hear about being rejected for Baldur's Gate 3 originally now, given the enormous success of the Original Sin series, selling over 1.5 million copies by the end of 2017. Larian Studios got the green light to start working on Baldur's Gate 3, not through luck, but through commitment to hard work and never giving up even when the times got rough. They knew what potential they had as a business, and they kept pushing forward for all of those years, even when financial death seemed certainty. And yes, they made mistakes along the way, but they also had to make some very difficult calls that kept them alive. Larian Studios' journey from economic collapse to most anticipated game of 2023, to me, is just truly fascinating. And I hope you've enjoyed this story. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you've enjoyed it. If you're interested in Baldur's Gate 3 content, then please do check out my other video, which is basically explaining why Baldur's Gate 3 might not be for everyone and really what a CRPG is and how to enjoy it. Either way, if you enjoyed the video, please drop a subscribe. I'll continue to make informational videos around upcoming and popular games. And until next time, I'll see ya.